Imagine this, a bustling restaurant, the kind reserved for life's most special celebrations. The soft glow of chandeliers bathes the room, couples toast to their futures, and laughter hums in the background. At one corner table sits a husband and wife, marking another milestone in their marriage, a night that should have been about love, loyalty, and the promises they made long ago. But then something happens that no one expects. The husband's smile falters as his gaze sharpens. Across the table, his wife leans closer, not toward him, but toward another man. Their whispers grow louder, their actions bolder, until it becomes impossible to ignore. Right there, on their anniversary, the truth comes crashing down in the most devastating way possible. What would you do if the person you trusted most, the one you built your life around, betrayed you in such a public and unforgivable manner? Would you walk away? Would you demand answers? Or would you plot your next move, determined to take back the power they stole from you? This is the story of one man's heartbreak and his quest for justice in the face of unimaginable betrayal. It's a story of resilience, decisions made in the heat of emotion, and a revenge that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about loyalty and love. Stay with us until the end, because this isn't just a story. It's a lesson, a warning, and a revelation that will leave you speechless. To truly understand how everything fell apart, we need to start at the beginning, when John and Emily's story felt like the perfect fairy tale. John, a reserved yet ambitious man, met Emily during their college years. She was everything he wasn't: vibrant, outgoing, the kind of person who lit up a room the moment she walked in. They came from different worlds, but somehow they found common ground in their shared dreams of building a future that would stand the test of time. Their romance started like so many others. Late-night study sessions turned into long conversations about their hopes and fears. John admired Emily's unwavering optimism, her ability to see beauty in life's smallest details. She, in turn, was drawn to his quiet determination and the way he always seemed to have a plan. It wasn't long before they became inseparable. After graduation, John landed a stable job in finance while Emily pursued a career in marketing. Together, they moved into a cozy suburban neighborhood, a place where neighbors greeted each other with warm smiles, where children played freely in the streets. It was the kind of place that felt safe, idyllic, almost timeless. They worked hard, saved every penny, and eventually bought their dream home, a modest 2-story house with a white picket fence and a garden that Emily loved to tend to on weekends. For 10 years, their marriage seemed unshakable. They celebrated the milestones that mark a shared life: the first housewarming party, promotions at work, family holidays spent laughing around the dinner table. They weathered the usual challenges: financial strain, disagreements about the future, even the heartache of a miscarriage early in their marriage. But through it all, they leaned on each other, believing that their love was strong enough to endure anything. Emily had a way of making life feel brighter. She was the planner, the one who made anniversaries special, with handwritten cards and surprise picnics. John, while less expressive, always found his own ways to show love, bringing her coffee in the mornings, fixing things around the house without being asked, holding her hand in silence when words weren't enough. Together, they built a life that many would envy. But as the years passed, subtle cracks began to form. Their schedules grew busier, their conversations shorter. John often worked late nights, caught up in the pressures of his demanding job. Emily, meanwhile, threw herself into her career, taking on new clients and spending more hours away from home. They told themselves it was temporary, that they were building a better future. But deep down, both began to feel the distance growing between them. Still, John believed in their bond. He told himself that every marriage had its rough patches, that this was simply one of theirs. When their 10th wedding anniversary approached, he saw it as a chance to reconnect, to remind Emily of everything they had built together. He made a reservation at their favorite restaurant, the one where they had celebrated so many special occasions. He thought about what he might say to her, how he might express his gratitude for the woman who had stood by his side for a decade. What John didn't know was that Emily's mind was elsewhere. Somewhere along the way, the woman who had once been his closest confidant had become a stranger. And on that night, their anniversary dinner, he would finally see the truth that had been hiding in plain sight all along. With their 10th anniversary approaching, John was determined to rekindle the spark that had once defined their marriage. He wanted the evening to be perfect, a chance to reconnect, to celebrate the life they had built together. He made a reservation at their favorite restaurant, the same place where they'd shared countless memories over the years. John even took the day off work, something he rarely did, to plan every detail. He picked out Emily's favorite flowers, a bouquet of white lilies, and had them waiting at the table. He even rehearsed what he wanted to say to her, a heartfelt reflection on their journey together and a promise to make the next decade even better. But in the weeks leading up to their anniversary, John couldn't ignore a growing sense of unease. Emily's behavior had been different. She seemed distracted, her once warm demeanor replaced by an air of detachment. She started coming home later than usual, often explaining it away as work running late or last-minute meetings. At first, John didn't think much of it. Her job in marketing was demanding after all. But then there were the phone calls. Emily would step out of the room to take them, her voice hushed, her answers vague when John asked who she'd been speaking to. He noticed other changes too. Emily had started dressing differently for work, sharper, more polished. She'd always taken pride in her appearance, but now it felt as though she was putting in extra effort, as though she wanted to impress someone. When John brought it up casually one morning, she brushed him off, laughing it away as nothing. But the unease lingered. Then there was Mark. He was a new colleague of Emily's, someone she'd mentioned a few times in passing. According to her, Mark was a key figure in one of her major projects, a collaborative effort that required them to spend a lot of time together. At first, John thought nothing of it. He trusted Emily, and he wanted to believe that Mark was just a work friend. But over time, the name began to crop up more frequently in their conversations, always accompanied by glowing praise. "Mark has such great ideas," she'd say, or "Mark really understands how to think outside the box." John tried to dismiss his growing doubts, telling himself that he was just overthinking things, but the nagging feeling in his gut wouldn't go away. He began to pay closer attention, noticing how Emily seemed to light up when her phone buzzed with a message, messages she never shared with him. He started to wonder if there was more to her late nights and secretive phone calls than she was letting on. The turning point came a few days before their anniversary. John had decided to surprise Emily at her office with lunch, a small gesture to show her he was thinking about her. He wanted to remind her of the little things that had always made their relationship special. But when he arrived, something felt off. Emily wasn't at her desk, and her assistant hesitated when John asked where she was. "I think she's in the conference room," the assistant said, her voice uncertain. "With Mark." John walked down the hallway, his footsteps heavy with a sense of dread. He reached the conference room and stopped outside the door, his hand hovering over the handle. Through the glass panel, he saw whoever had come in, Emily and Mark, sitting close together. Their heads bent as they shared a private laugh. It wasn't just the proximity that bothered him. It was the look in Emily's eyes, a softness, an intimacy that John hadn't seen in months. He didn't confront her then. Instead, he walked away, his mind racing. For the first time, he couldn't deny the possibility that something was wrong. That night, as Emily came home and kissed him on the cheek, her smile as bright as ever, John felt the weight of his suspicions pressing down on him. He told himself he needed more proof, more clarity before he could say anything. And so, he waited. But the wait would not last long. Their anniversary dinner was only days away, and what unfolded that evening would confirm everything John had feared and more. The night of their anniversary finally arrived. John had poured every ounce of his effort into making it special. He dressed in his best suit, a crisp navy blue one that Emily had always said brought out his eyes. The restaurant was exactly as he remembered it, warm, intimate, with soft candlelight dancing across the tables. The bouquet of white lilies sat perfectly on their reserved table, a small card tucked between the stems with a simple yet heartfelt message. "Here's to us." Emily arrived a little late, something that John tried to dismiss as traffic or a long day at work. But when she walked in, his heart sank. She looked stunning, as always, but there was something detached about her smile as she greeted him. Her eyes flitted across the room as though she was searching for something. Or someone. John rose to pull out her chair, but she barely acknowledged the gesture, her attention already elsewhere. He brushed it off, convincing himself that he was imagining things. After all, this was their night. He refused to let his doubts ruin it. The evening began with polite conversation, though it felt strained. Emily kept glancing at her phone, her fingers tapping idly on the table. When the waiter came to take their orders, John tried to lighten the mood. "Let's get the lobster," he suggested, recalling how much she loved it. Emily barely smiled, muttering something about not being very hungry. John felt a pang of disappointment, but swallowed it, determined to salvage the evening. Halfway through the dinner, the atmosphere took a sharp turn. As they sipped their drinks, John noticed Emily stiffen slightly, her eyes locking onto someone across the room. He turned to see what had caught her attention and felt his stomach twist. It was Mark. He was seated at a nearby table, alone at first, but his presence was unmistakable. John's mind raced. "Oh, what is he doing here?" he wondered. The timing felt too coincidental, too deliberate. Emily's demeanor shifted entirely. She seemed more animated, her posture leaning slightly forward as if she was waiting for something. Or someone. Moments later, Mark got up from his table and walked over to theirs. What happened next would haunt John for the rest of his life. Mark greeted Emily with a familiarity that went far beyond colleagues. She smiled at him in a way John hadn't seen in years, a smile full of warmth, affection, even excitement. And then, as if John wasn't sitting right there, they began chatting like old friends reunited. Their laughter echoing in the intimate setting of the restaurant. John felt invisible, his presence reduced to an afterthought. But the ultimate betrayal came when Mark leaned down and whispered something into Emily's ear. She laughed, her hand brushing his arm in a gesture so casual yet intimate that it sent a wave of nausea through John. And then it happened. Mark placed a hand on Emily's shoulder, his thumb grazing her skin as he leaned in to kiss her cheek, a kiss that lingered just a second too long. Time seemed to freeze for John. His chest tightened, his vision blurred. He could hear the soft gasps of other diners, the clinking of glasses abruptly silenced as the room turned to watch the unfolding drama. Emily, seemingly unfazed, barely glanced at John before saying something to Mark that made him laugh again. It was as though she didn't care, it didn't even try to hide it. John's hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the table. His mind raced with a whirlwind of emotions, shock, disbelief, anger, humiliation. He felt like a fool, a man who had spent years building a life with someone who could so easily cast it aside. He wanted to shout, to demand answers, to ask Emily how she could do this to him on their anniversary of all nights. But instead, he sat frozen, the weight of his emotions pinning him to his seat. Finally, John stood. The room seemed to hold its breath as he pushed back his chair and threw his napkin onto the table. His voice, when he spoke, was low but steady. "I can't do this," he said, his words directed more at himself than at Emily. She looked up, startled for the first time that evening. "John, wait," she began, but he held up a hand to silence her. "No, he said firmly. "I've waited long enough." Without another word, John turned and walked out of the restaurant. As the door closed behind him, he felt a mix of relief and despair. The cool night air hit him like a slap, but it was nothing compared to the storm raging inside him. He stood there for a moment, staring at the city lights, his mind replaying the scene over and over like a cruel, endless loop. For the first time in their 10 years of marriage, John realized that the life he thought they shared was nothing more than a lie. And in that moment, he made a decision that would change everything. He wouldn't beg for answers. He wouldn't demand an explanation. Instead, he would take control of his life, starting with the end of their marriage. After that devastating night, John didn't go home. He drove aimlessly for hours, the events of the evening replaying in his mind like a broken record. The weight of Emily's betrayal bore down on him with every mile, and by the time he pulled into a quiet parking lot, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. There was no going back. This wasn't something he could fix with a conversation or a counseling session. The life he thought he had, the marriage he believed in, was over. The following morning, John contacted a divorce attorney. The decision felt both liberating and agonizing. He had never imagined himself in this position, drafting documents to dissolve a decade of memories, shared dreams, and the promises they'd made to each other. Yet, as painful as it was, John knew it was the only way forward. Trust had been shattered, and without it, there was nothing left to salvage. The legal battle that followed was anything but easy. Emily didn't take the news well. At first, she tried to minimize her actions, dismissing the events of their anniversary dinner as a misunderstanding. When that didn't work, she turned to anger, accusing John of overreacting and making rash decisions. She even claimed that her relationship with Mark was strictly professional, despite the evidence to the contrary. But John stood firm. For the first time in years, he prioritized his own well-being over keeping the peace. His attorney advised him to document everything, and John poured his energy into gathering the necessary evidence. Phone records, messages, and even witness statements from mutual friends who had seen Emily and Mark together, outside of work. It wasn't about revenge. It was about protecting himself and ensuring a fair outcome. The most challenging part of the divorce process was deciding what to do about their children. John and Emily had 2 young kids, ages 8 and 5, who had no idea what was happening. For their sake, John tried to remain civil, even as the custody battle grew contentious. Emily argued for full custody, insisting that her role as a mother outweighed any mistake she had made as a wife. But John knew he had every right to fight for his children, and he did so with the same quiet determination that had always defined him. Throughout the ordeal, Emily made several attempts to reconcile. She sent long, emotional messages apologizing for her actions, promising to change, and asking for another chance. She reminded John of the good times they'd shared, the life they had built together, and the family they had created. For a moment, John wavered. Part of him wanted to believe that she was sincere, that they could find a way to rebuild what had been broken. But then he remembered the look in her eyes that night at the restaurant, the way she had laughed with Mark, completely oblivious to the pain she was causing. He thought about the months of lies, the late nights, the secrecy. Forgiveness, he realized, wasn't the same as forgetting. And while he could forgive Emily for her mistakes, he couldn't forget the betrayal or rebuild a marriage built on broken trust. The divorce was finalized 6 months later. John was granted joint custody of their children, and the assets were divided equitably. Walking out of the courthouse that day, John felt a strange mix of emotions: grief for the life he had lost, relief for the closure he had gained, and a quiet sense of hope for the future. It wasn't the ending he had envisioned, but it was a new beginning. In the months that followed, John focused on healing. He took up running, something he hadn't done since his college days, and found solace in the rhythmic pounding of his feet against the pavement. He started attending therapy, not just to process the betrayal, but to rediscover himself after years of putting Emily and their marriage first. Slowly but surely, he began to rebuild his life, not as a husband, but as an individual. Emily, on the other hand, seemed to struggle with the fallout of her actions. Word of her infidelity spread among their social circle, and the respect she once commanded at work began to waver. Mark, who had been so central to the collapse of their marriage, disappeared from her life shortly after the divorce was finalized. Whether she regretted her choices, John couldn't say, but by then, it no longer mattered. For John, the journey wasn't just about moving on. It was about learning and growing from the experience. He came to understand the importance of boundaries, of recognizing the signs when something feels wrong, and of valuing his own worth in a relationship. He realized that love, at its core, must be built on trust, mutual respect, and a willingness to put in the work, values that had been missing in his marriage for far too long. And so while the pain of betrayal would always be a part of his story, it no longer defined him. It became a chapter in a much larger book, one filled with lessons, resilience, and the quiet strength of a man who refused to let heartbreak destroy him. As John stood at the edge of his new beginning, he found peace in the knowledge that he had done the right thing, for himself, for his children, and for the life he still had ahead of him. And, in the end, that was enough. And so John's story comes full circle, a journey that began with love and trust but was tested by betrayal and heartbreak. As we look back, it's clear that this isn't just a story about infidelity. It's a story of resilience, self-discovery, and the courage to choose yourself when the world you built begins to crumble. John started this chapter of his life as a devoted husband, pouring his heart and soul into a marriage he believed would stand the test of time. For years, he overlooked the subtle changes, the growing distance, telling himself that every relationship has its struggles. He believed in the strength of their bond, in the promises they made to one another, in the life they had built together. But that trust was shattered in one heartbreaking moment, a moment that forced John to confront a truth he never thought he'd face. The betrayal he experienced was a wound that cut deep, leaving scars that would take time to heal. Yet, rather than letting that pain define him, John made a choice. He chose to stand up for himself, to demand the respect and honesty he deserved. He walked away from the lies, the deceit, and the heartbreak, and in doing so, he reclaimed his power. But this wasn't just a story of loss. It was a story of transformation. Through the pain, John found strength. Through the betrayal, he found clarity. And through the end of his marriage, he found a new beginning. He learned that sometimes the hardest decisions are the ones that lead to the greatest growth. He learned to value his worth, to set boundaries, and to prioritize his own happiness, not out of selfishness, but out of self-respect. As you reflect on John's journey, ask yourself, what would you have done in his situation? Could you walk away from someone you've spent years loving and forgiving? Or would you try to mend what's broken, even when trust seems impossible to rebuild? These are the questions that challenge us, that force us to confront our own beliefs about love, loyalty, and self-worth. Let John's story be a reminder that even in our darkest moments, we have the power to rise above. That betrayal doesn't have to define us, and that healing is always possible if we're willing to take the first step. It's a story that teaches us the value of trust, the pain of losing it, and the strength it takes to move forward. If you found this story compelling, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done if you were in John's shoes? How do you think betrayal should be handled in a relationship? We'd love to hear your perspective. And don't forget, if this story moved you, if it made you think, or if it touched your heart in any way, please show your support. Like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit that notification bell so you never miss another story like this. Your engagement helps us bring you more real-life stories of resilience, heartbreak, and the human spirit. Thank you for staying with us through John's journey. His story is just one of many, and we're here to share them all with you. Until next time, remember, even in life's most painful moments, there is always a path to healing, a chance to grow, and the hope of a brighter tomorrow.